Imagine holding a single banknote worth $100 trillion. 100 trillion, a number so large it's almost meaningless. More than the wealth of entire nations. You are holding it in your hand right now, and it isn't enough to buy a loaf of bread. It isn't even enough for a bus ticket home. This really happened. In one country, not centuries ago but within the last 20 years, people carried their money to the shops in wheelbarrows, not because they were rich, but because it took a wheelbarrow of cash to buy a single bag of groceries, and by the time they reached the counter, the price had already gone up. How does this happen? How does the money in an entire country become worth less than the paper it's printed on? It wasn't a natural disaster. It wasn't a war with a foreign enemy. It was a chain of decisions, each one meant to fix the last, that together destroyed a nation's currency so completely it had to be abandoned. By the end, you'll understand exactly how a functioning country talked itself into printing a $100 trillion bill and why it could never stop. To understand how far Zimbabwe fell, you have to see how high it started. For much of the 20th century, this was one of the most productive economies in all of Africa. It was known as the breadbasket of the region. Its farms grew so much maize, tobacco, wheat, and beef that it didn't just feed itself, it fed its neighbors. Its mines produced gold and platinum. At independence in 1980, its currency traded at roughly the same value as the US dollar. This was not a poor, broken country waiting to fail. It was a middle-income nation with real industry, real exports, and real wealth. Which is what makes what happened next so important. Because this wasn't the story of a country that never had anything. It's the story of a country that had a great deal and destroyed it through a sequence of choices. And the first of those choices came from a government that needed something every collapsing power eventually needs. It needed money and it needed loyalty. And the way it chose to buy both would tear the foundation out from under the entire economy. Around the year 2000, the government launched a sweeping land reform program. On the surface, it was framed as justice, taking farmland from a small number of established commercial farmers and redistributing it. But in practice, much of that land went to people with political connections rather than farming experience, and often without the tools, seeds, or knowledge to work it. The result was not a transfer of production, it was the collapse of it. The numbers are staggering. Within a few years, agricultural output fell by roughly half. Tobacco, the country's single biggest export earner, collapsed to a fraction of what it had been. Factories that depended on farm goods slowed and shut. Exports dried up. And here is the fatal part. As the economy shrank, so did the government's tax revenue. It fell from around a quarter of the economy to almost nothing. So now the government had a catastrophe on its hands. A shattered economy, no tax income, and bills it still had to pay. Soldiers, officials, imports, and allies to keep happy. It faced the oldest trap in this entire series. It needed money it did not have. And it turned to the one tool that has destroyed empires for 2,000 years. It started to print. And here is what almost no one understands about hyperinflation. The printing wasn't the disease. It was the symptom. It's easy to look at Zimbabwe and say the government simply printed too much money. But that's like blaming the fever for the infection. The real collapse had already happened in the fields. The country had destroyed its ability to produce actual things: food, goods, exports. The money printing was a desperate attempt to paper over a hole where the real economy used to be. That's the trap. Once you've gutted what your economy actually makes, printing money doesn't create wealth. It just spreads the same shrinking pile of real goods across an ever-growing mountain of paper. And there is no natural stopping point, because the moment you stop printing, you can't pay anyone at all. At first, the printing seemed to work. Bills got paid, but prices started to rise, then to climb, then to run. The government printed more to keep up, which pushed prices higher, which meant it had to print even more. The spiral had begun, and it fed on itself. The central bank kept issuing bigger and bigger notes, first thousands, then millions. It kept slashing zeros off the currency and starting over, and within months, the zeros came roaring back. By 2008, the numbers stopped making sense. In the middle of that year, annual inflation was in the millions of %, and it kept accelerating. Then it reached a place almost no economy in human history had ever gone. At its peak, in November 2008, prices in Zimbabwe were doubling roughly every 24 hours. Think about what that means. A price you saw in the morning had doubled by the next day. Your salary lost half its value overnight while you slept. Workers demanded to be paid daily, then rushed to spend it within the hour, because by evening it would buy less. Shops repriced their goods multiple times a day. Some simply stopped putting prices on anything at all. The banknotes became surreal. The central bank printed a note worth $10 million, then $100 million, then $1 billion, and finally, in January 2009, the most infamous banknote ever issued by any government in history, 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars. A single piece of paper with 14 zeros. On the day it was released, it was worth only a few US dollars. Within weeks, it was worth nothing at all. Today it sells to collectors around the world for far more than it could ever buy when it was real money. And behind every one of those absurd numbers was a human being. Teachers and doctors saw their monthly salaries, paid in trillions, amount to about $1, barely half the cost of a bus ride to work. Life savings built over decades vanished in weeks. People became billionaires and starved at the same time. A modern economy was reduced to something almost medieval. With cash worthless, people went back to barter. Rent was paid in food. Goods were traded for goods. Essentials were bought and sold in secret, using foreign currency, US dollars and South African rand, because no one would accept the national money anymore. The banks limited how much you could withdraw, but it hardly mattered. Within a week, the limit couldn't buy a loaf of bread. That is the image from the very beginning of this video. The wheelbarrow of cash, the 100 trillion note that couldn't buy bread. It wasn't an exaggeration, it was an ordinary afternoon. And finally, in 2009, the government did the only thing left to do. It surrendered. It officially abandoned its own currency entirely and allowed people to use foreign money, mostly the US dollar, in its place. The Zimbabwean dollar, the money of a once prosperous nation, simply ceased to exist. Almost immediately, prices stabilized. Because the problem had never really been solved, it had been abandoned. The only way to stop the spiral was to stop using the money altogether. So what actually killed Zimbabwe's money? It's tempting to say they printed too much. But that's only the last link in the chain. The real cause came earlier, and it's the same lesson that runs through every collapse. They destroyed the real economy first, the farms, the exports, the actual production of real things, and then tried to replace that lost wealth with paper. Money was never really the problem. Money is just a claim on real goods and services. When Zimbabwe gutted its ability to produce those goods, the money was always going to fail. The printing didn't create the collapse. It just revealed how empty the economy had already become. Because a currency is a mirror, it reflects the real strength of the country behind it. You can print all the paper you want, but you cannot print food. You cannot print exports. You cannot print trust. And the moment a nation forgets that, no number of zeros can save it, not even 14 of them. Zimbabwe eventually clawed its way towards stability, though the scars never fully healed, and years later, echoes of the same crisis would return. Once a country has watched its money die, the fear of it never truly leaves. But Zimbabwe wasn't the first nation to print itself into ruin. It wasn't even the worst. Decades earlier, in the heart of Europe, another country pushed the printing presses even harder, and the collapse that followed didn't just destroy a currency, it helped set the stage for one of the darkest chapters in human history. That story is next.